It seemed like such a reasonable idea at the time. My parents, bless their hearts, aren't getting any younger. They live 3 states away, and the visits were getting harder. Navigating airports, sleeping on my less than comfortable pull-out sofa in the den, feeling like they were imposing, which they weren't, but you know, parents. My wife, Linda, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a little place for them right here? A small, comfortable cottage in the backyard where they could have their own space, stay for longer visits, maybe even eventually. Well, we weren't there yet, but having the option felt important. So I did my homework, measured the backyard, plenty of space. Checked the city zoning. Accessory dwelling units, ADUs, were generally permitted under 500 square feet with proper setbacks. Found a local architect who drew up beautiful plans for a charming little 450 square foot cottage. 1 bedroom, small living area, accessible bathroom. Designed to match the style and materials of our main house, tasteful siding, same roof shingles, everything by the book. We were excited. Mom and Dad were thrilled at the prospect. All we needed was the rubber stamp from the Oakview Gardens HOA Architectural Review Committee, ARC. Simple, right? Wrong. Oh, so profoundly wrong. We submitted the plans, complete with material samples and detailed site drawings. Weeks went by. Then, the summons arrived. Not an approval letter, but a summons to appear before the ARC, held naturally in the beige-on-beige Community Clubhouse Conference Room, presided over by the formidable Mrs. Davenport, HOA President and ARC Chairwoman ex officio. Mrs. Davenport was a woman who seemed to believe that any architectural feature more exciting than a gutter downspout was a slippery slope to anarchy. She peered at our plans over her bifocals, her lips pursed as if she'd just tasted spoiled milk. 2 other ARC members flanked her, nodding solemnly at her pronouncements like devout acolytes. "Mr. Pendleton," she began, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth, "the committee has reviewed your application for a guest cottage." She said the words like they were vaguely obscene. "Yes, Mrs. Davenport," I said politely, "for my aging parents during visits." "Be that as it may," she continued, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the plans. "This proposal presents several significant issues according to the Oakview Gardens covenants, conditions, and restrictions." She then proceeded to eviscerate our modest little cottage plan. "Firstly," she declared, "Bylaw 32, Section A explicitly prohibits the construction of detached accessory dwelling units with full plumbing and kitchen facilities, regardless of intended use, to maintain the single-family residential character of our community." "But the city allows ADUs," I started. "City zoning is secondary to our more restrictive covenants, Mr. Pendleton," she cut me off smoothly. "Secondly, even if it were permissible, the proposed structure, at 450 square feet, combined with your existing patio, exceeds the maximum allowable lot coverage for all accessory structures as defined in Bylaw 19, Section D, by approximately 7%. 7%. We were talking about maybe 30 square feet over the limit. Furthermore," she wasn't done, "while the general style is noted, the proposed brick foundation does not precisely match the heritage red brick blend used on the primary dwelling, circa 1998, as required by ARC Guideline 7B. And the proposed location, while meeting city setbacks, slightly impedes the tertiary afternoon sightline from the Henderson property 2 doors down, potentially violating Bylaw 41 regarding view preservation." I stared at her, speechless. Full plumbing ban, lot coverage, brick texture mismatch, tertiary afternoon sightlines? Were they serious? "So, what are you saying?" Linda asked hesitantly. "We are saying," Mrs. Davenport announced with grim finality, "that the application is denied. Unequivocally. We tried to appeal. We offered to shrink the cottage to under 400 square feet. We offered to use different foundation materials, though matching 25-year-old brick is nigh impossible. We offered to plant fast-growing shrubs to appease the Hendersons' precious tertiary sightline. No dice. Mrs. Davenport and the ARC were immovable. No detached structures with kitchens or full baths. Period. Lot coverage rules were absolute. Aesthetic harmony was paramount. My parents could continue sleeping on the pull-out sofa in the den, apparently. I left that final appeal meeting feeling utterly defeated and incandescently angry. It wasn't just about the guest house anymore. It was about the sheer arbitrary power of this committee, dictating every minute detail of my property based on rules seemingly designed to prevent anyone from actually living comfortably. I slumped into my home office chair, staring blankly at the thick, 3-ring binder containing the Oakview Gardens CC and Rs, the source of all my woes. No habitable dwellings, I muttered, flipping through the pages aimlessly. Accessory structures okay under 200 square feet. No plumbing. Unless it's a pool house, then different rules apply. Blah, blah, blah. My eyes scanned the dense legalese, looking for I didn't even know what. A loophole? A contradiction? Some forgotten clause I could use? And then I saw it. Buried deep in a section about general land use restrictions, after paragraphs about single-family residential zoning, was a small, almost throwaway line. Unless otherwise permitted by local zoning ordinances for specific non-commercial uses, such as private recreational facilities or places of assembly. Further down, in the definitions section, place of assembly, a structure designed for the gathering of persons for civic, social, or religious purposes. Religious purposes. My brain snagged on that phrase. The HOA rules were ironclad about guest houses, ADUs. But what about other kinds of buildings? The city zoning code, I vaguely remembered from my initial research, had different classifications and sometimes different rules, especially regarding things like setbacks or even height restrictions for places of worship compared to residential structures. Could the HOA rules be preempted? A crazy, audacious, possibly sacrilegious idea began to form. They wouldn't let me build a comfortable place for my visiting parents, but what if I built a chapel? A small, charming backyard chapel. A place of assembly for religious purposes. Even if those purposes were just my own private contemplation of how much I disliked the HOA. It was insane. It was perfect. The idea lodged itself in my brain and refused to leave. A backyard chapel. It sounded ridiculous, even to me. I wasn't particularly devout. We went to church maybe twice a year, Christmas and Easter, mostly out of tradition. But the idea, it had a certain elegant, malicious beauty to it. Could I actually do it? First step, more research. Less about divine inspiration, more about earthly regulations. I spent hours digging into city zoning codes, state statutes, and even federal law. That's when I stumbled upon ORLUEPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, a federal law designed to protect religious institutions from unduly burdensome or discriminatory land use regulations. It meant cities, and potentially, arguably, even HOAs, had to tread very carefully when restricting land use for religious purposes. They needed a compelling governmental interest and had to use the least restrictive means possible. Could building a small, private chapel be considered religious exercise? Could arguing against it based purely on aesthetics or a desire to ban all accessory structures be seen as an undue burden? It seemed plausible. At least plausible enough to make the HOA's lawyers pause and think, which was half the battle. Okay, the legal angle had potential. Now, the design. It couldn't look like a guest house disguised with a pointy roof. It had to look like a chapel, at least enough to support the place of assembly/worship classification. But it also needed to be potentially usable down the line for quiet contemplation by visiting parents. This required professional help. I found Faith, a young architect whose online portfolio showcased some interesting modern takes on traditional forms. I scheduled a meeting, feeling slightly ridiculous. "Mr. Pendleton," Faith said, after I'd nervously explained my situation and presented my loophole theory. She looked intrigued, a small smile playing on her lips. "So, let me get this straight. The HOA banned your guest house, so you want me to design you a legally defensible backyard chapel that could, hypothetically, also function as a very serene guest suite?" "Essentially, yes," I admitted, but emphasis on the chapel part for permitting. Think non-denominational contemplation space. Small footprint, maybe 350 square feet, but with architectural elements that clearly say place of peace, not place to crash. Faith leaned back, tapping her pen. "This is fascinating and legally audacious. Raluipa could give you leverage against HOA aesthetic rules, maybe even some zoning restrictions if they unduly burden your religious exercise, which can be broadly defined. But the structure itself still needs to meet city building codes for assembly use, which might differ from residential. And the use has to be somewhat consistent with the claim. You can't just build it and immediately rent it out on Airbnb." "Strictly private contemplation," I assured her, "and occasional fellowship with like-minded individuals seeking tranquility. My parents, my kids, maybe Stan if he promised to be quiet." "All right," Faith grinned. "Let's design a chapel. Steep roof pitch, absolutely. Tall, narrow windows, definitely. Maybe some nice arched ones, stained glass. We can do subtle, abstract patterns. A small steeple? Ooh, that's pushing it on height, but maybe a decorative cupola or bellcot, technically different from a full steeple, might fly under the radar. And plumbing? Every contemplation space needs a powder room, right?" I suggested innocently. "For ablutions. And maybe a small sink for arranging flowers?" "Of course," Faith nodded solemnly. "Ablutions." We spent the next few weeks refining the design. The Pendleton Place of Peace, as the plans were officially titled. It was small but elegant. Steep roof, board and batten siding, a classic American chapel look, definitely not matching my brick house. Tall arched windows destined for simple stained glass, and a charming little bell cot on top. No actual bell, just the structure. Inside, it was mostly open space, easily adaptable, with a small, discreetly placed powder room. Faith focused on ensuring it met city codes for a small assembly structure, including egress and basic accessibility, while I focused on how much it would likely annoy Mrs. Davenport. Getting the city permits was the next major hurdle. Faith and I submitted the plans, carefully labeled Detached Accessory Structure, Private Assembly, Contemplation Use. We highlighted the non-residential nature, the lack of kitchen facilities, and compliance with assembly building codes. We braced ourselves for questions, objections, maybe even a zoning board hearing. But somewhat anticlimactically, after a few weeks and a review by a seemingly overworked city planner who probably just saw small detached structure, no kitchen, and stamped it, the permit was approved. Approved as an accessory building for private assembly, not an ADU. Crucial difference. Step 1. Complete. Now, to find a builder. I needed someone reliable, someone who wouldn't ask too many awkward questions about why I was building a chapel in my backyard. I found Gus the builder. Gus was old-school, flannel shirt, seen-it-all type. He looked at Faith's elegant plans, looked at my suburban house, looked back at the plans. Huh, he grunted, scratching his beard. Place of peace, eh? Looks like a church. It's a multi-purpose contemplation space, I chirped, using my well-rehearsed line. Gus just shrugged. Whatever you say, pal. Plans are permitted by the city. Specs look straightforward. Materials list is clear. You pay me, I build it. What you contemplate in there is your own darn business. Perfect. Construction began a few weeks later. Gus's crew was efficient, professional. They dug the foundation, poured the concrete slab. So far, so normal. Neighbors probably assumed I was building a fancy workshop or a high-end shed, the kind the HOA might actually approve, ironically. Mrs. Davenport drove by slowly a few times. Her eyes narrowed, but the initial stages looked like any other small outbuilding. Then the framing went up, and the steeply pitched roofline started taking shape. Eyebrows were raised. "Building a big one, Arthur," called out my neighbor Jim from across the street, pausing his lawn mowing. "Just need lots of headroom for contemplation," I yelled back. The real turning point was the bell cot. When Gus's crew hoisted the small, purely decorative tower structure onto the roof peak, the neighborhood murmurs turned into outright buzzing. It looked undeniably church-like now. Even without a bell, the shape was unmistakable. That afternoon, I received the first official inquiry letter from the HOA. Dear Mr. Pendleton, it has come to our attention that construction is underway on a detached accessory structure. Please provide the RC with a copy of the approved plans and ARC approval letter for this structure at your earliest convenience. I politely replied with a copy of the city building permit for the assembly structure and a note saying ARC review wasn't required for this type of permitted structure under Bylaw X, Section Y. A slightly creative interpretation Faith and my lawyer had helped me formulate. This, I knew, was just lobbing a grenade into their meticulously ordered world. The final, glorious provocation was the installation of the windows. Not just plain glass, stained glass. I'd commissioned them from a local artist, nothing overtly religious, just beautiful abstract patterns in blues, greens, and golds. But when the light hit them, pure chapel ambiance. As the installers carefully fitted the last window, I saw Mrs. Davenport standing at the edge of my property, phone camera held high, face a mask of thunderous disbelief. The cease and desist letters started arriving the next day, typed in what I imagined was furiously capitalized font. Immediate cessation of unauthorized construction. Non-compliant architectural style, ecclesiastical. Structure exceeds permitted aesthetic guidelines. Potential zoning violation, misrepresentation of use. They were panicking. And I hadn't even put furniture in yet. The Pendleton Place of Peace, as the small, discreet sign near its door now proclaimed, was finished. And it was, objectively, beautiful. The board and batten siding gleamed. The steep roof looked charming. The stained glass caught the afternoon sun beautifully, and the little bell cot added a touch of quaintness. It also looked about as appropriate in our neighborhood of beige ranch houses and sensible landscaping as a spaceship landing on the 18th green. The HOA, predictably, lost what was left of its collective mind. The cease and desist letters escalated to demands for immediate demolition, accompanied by threats of fines that started at eye-watering and rapidly approached sell-a-kidney territory. Their main lines of attack were aesthetics. It didn't match anything. The style was unapproved. The steeple-like bell cot violated roofline rules. The stained glass was inconsistent with community character. Use? They were convinced it was a guest house in disguise, violating the ADU ban. They demanded proof of its assembly or religious purpose. Permit challenge. They formally petitioned the city zoning board to review and potentially revoke my permit, claiming I had misrepresented the structure's intended use. This was where things got serious. Time to lawyer up properly. I found a firm specializing in land use and, crucially, Arluipa cases. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Miss Diaz, reviewed the HOA bylaws, the city codes, my permits, and Faith's plans. "Okay, Arthur," she said after a lengthy consultation, "this is creative. The city permit for an assembly structure is your strongest shield. The HOA's aesthetic arguments might be weakened by Arluipa if we frame this correctly as burdening your right to private religious exercise, which includes contemplation and small fellowship gatherings. The key," she emphasized, leaning forward, "is use. You cannot treat it like a guest house. No permanent residence, no kitchen appliances beyond maybe a coffee maker for fellowship hour. Its primary demonstrable use must align with the permit and your religious freedom claim." "So, Mom and Dad visiting for a month and staying in the contemplation suite?" I asked nervously. Miss Diaz smiled thinly. "As long as they are guests participating in the contemplative atmosphere of your private sanctuary and not establishing residency, you're likely on solid ground, but expect the HOA to scrutinize everything." The city zoning board hearing was tense. The HOA lawyer presented photos, argued vehemently it was a sham ADU, and demanded revocation. Miss Diaz calmly presented the approved permit, highlighted the lack of kitchen facilities, quoted the city's own definition of assembly space, and subtly invoked Arluipa, reminding the board of the federal protections for religious land use. The zoning officials looked confused, caught between angry HOA members and potential federal lawsuits. They ultimately decided to uphold the permit as issued for assembly contemplation, but added a condition. Any change in use to residential would require a new permit application, which would obviously be denied. A partial victory. This drove the HOA into a frenzy. An emergency meeting was called, "Review and Action Regarding Unauthorized Ecclesiastical Structure at 112 Maple Lane." This was the big one. The clubhouse meeting room was packed. Mrs. Davenport presided, her face grim. Their lawyer laid out their case again: sham structure, aesthetic violations, demanding crippling fines, and a lawsuit to force demolition. Then it was my turn. Miss Diaz spoke first, calmly outlining the legal points: city permits, Arluipa, lack of specific bylaw prohibition against this type of structure used for its permitted purpose. Then I spoke. I didn't rant, I didn't rave. I spoke quietly about the stress of modern life, the need for a private space for reflection and peace away from the main house. I mentioned how different traditions value contemplation. I talked about wanting a quiet place for fellowship with family and close friends who shared similar values, leaving those values deliberately vague. I emphasized it wasn't a dwelling, just a sanctuary. I might have laid it on a bit thick, but hey, when fighting the HOA, sometimes you need a little sermon. The reaction was mixed. Some residents looked sympathetic, or maybe just bored. Others, allies of Davenport and Henderson, who was practically vibrating in his seat, looked outraged. The board members whispered amongst themselves, looking nervously at their lawyer, then at Miss Diaz. The threat of a costly Arluipa lawsuit clearly weighed heavily. The HOA meeting didn't end with a clear victory, but it wasn't a total defeat either. Faced with valid city permits, the looming shadow of Arluipa, and Miss Diaz's calm but firm legal arguments, the board balked at voting for immediate legal action to force demolition. They knew it would be an expensive uphill battle with uncertain odds. Instead, they chose the path of bureaucratic trench warfare. They voted to impose the maximum allowable fines for the aesthetic violations, the incompatible architectural style, the unapproved materials, stained glass, apparently, the non-compliant roof feature, the bell coat. The fines were substantial, designed to bleed me dry or force compliance. They also passed a resolution requiring me to submit quarterly usage reports, certifying that the structure was not being used as a dwelling unit, an annoying, intrusive measure, but one Miss Diaz advised we could probably live with, and challenge later if needed. So began the uneasy peace. The fines started arriving. Miss Diaz started firing back legal letters challenging their validity based on the permit and potential LUIPA protections. It became a slow, grinding war of paperwork and passive aggression. But the chapel? It stayed, standing proudly and perhaps a little smugly in my backyard. Life with a backyard chapel is weird. I won't lie. At first, I mostly avoided it, feeling slightly guilty about the whole charade. But then I actually started using it. On stressful days, I'd go out there, sit in the quiet space. I'd put in a comfortable armchair and a small bookshelf, look at the light filtering through the stained glass, and just breathe. It was peaceful, annoyingly so. My parents visited. They absolutely loved the guest contemplation suite, as I jokingly called it. They stayed for 3 weeks, slept on a comfortable futon I put in there, used the ablutions powder room, read books, and declared it the most peaceful visit they'd ever had. I sent the HOA a usage report stating the chapel had hosted 2 long-term visiting scholars engaged in profound reflection. I'm not sure they bought it, but they couldn't prove otherwise. Neighbor reactions remain mixed. Kids think it's cool, a tiny castle or church in the backyard. Some neighbors actively avoid eye contact. Others ask awkward questions. So, what exactly is your church, Arthur? Stan finds the whole thing endlessly amusing and occasionally leaves joke collection plates on the doorstep. Mrs. Davenport glares daggers whenever she sees me, but her complaints have mostly shifted to other, lesser neighborhood infractions, like someone's slightly too tall mailbox flag. The legal battle over the fines drags on, but the threat of demolition seems to have receded. The structure is there, permitted, and short of catching me renting it out or moving someone in permanently, the HOA's leverage is limited. So, did I win? I didn't get the simple guest house I originally wanted. I spent a fortune on architects, builders, stained glass, and now lawyers. I'm locked in a perpetual cold war with my HOA. But I have a chapel. A beautiful, quiet, utterly ridiculous backyard chapel. It's a monument to spite, sure, but it's also, unexpectedly, a genuinely peaceful place. It's proof that sometimes the most absurd solution is the only one that works. It's a testament to the fact that if the rules won't bend, sometimes you just have to find a loophole big enough to drive a steeple through. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll go contemplate for a while. Maybe reflect on the irony of it all, or maybe just take a nap on the futon. It's very quiet in there. Amen to that.